Harold Tribunas, that we.
Yes, I did. I have a meeting with him on the 13th.
Okay, because we expect you to. I mean, he said yesterday to me informally that he's perfectly happy to.
Yes, yes. I'm very excited.
We're gonna start.
You're alive.
I am.
Yeah.
Everyone's face.
Yeah, there is.
Oh.
Maybe you can fight her.
I have positive.
Maybe ask him someone.
Was I sleeping?
I ordered five.
No, you on target. No.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies. Today's Friday lecture is entitled Where Will We Go From Here? Martin Luther King Jr.'s Still Unanswered Question with Professor Clayborne Carson. Kindly note that since this is a lecture that is being live streamed, it will continue to be available to the public through our class web page. And also, please submit any questions or comments you might have through the YouTube chat, so I will be then able to convey them to our speaker in the Q&A section of our conversation. I do want to remind all of us that for those of us who are here at Stanford, we are in the land and territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We want to take this opportunity to offer our gratitude for the land, for the water, and for the air that surrounds us. And we want to pay our respects to the past, to the present, and also to the future of the Ohlone and Lenape peoples who continue to be present in these, their homelands, and throughout the diasporas. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to take a minute to explain in some way why in this quarter we're going to be trying to shed some light on the Afro-Latin American populations. And it might be unusual for a Center of Latin American Studies to have a Martin Luther King scholar, probably of the world, with us today. But I think it's extremely, auspicious to start in this way. The latest data we have from something called the PERLA project, the project on ethnicity, race, and in Latin America, which is very controversial because of how important their findings are, I would say. It suggests that out of the 550 million Latin Americans, probably 130 are indigenous in some classification, and about 40 million are Afro descendants. I would also want people to put a little perspective on the way they think about the Afro-Latin American populations. We know from something called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, again, a highly controversial project, but very important project that has used the ship manifestos of 34,000 vessels that cross the Atlantic, forcing people away from their homelands into the enslavement in the Americas. That data set tells us that 366,033 individuals embarked, if not necessarily disembarked, to come into mainland North America. The majority of them between 1726 and 1755. Okay, 1775, I'm sorry. So 336,000. To put this in perspective, mainland Spanish Americas had something like 649,461. This is the Spanish Americas, the mainland areas. It does not include Brazil, and it does not include the Caribbean. Brazil, the data we have for this suggests that it's about 3.5 million enslaved peoples brought into Brazil. The Caribbean, probably something like 5.1 million. These tiny territories scattered throughout the Caribbean. This Middle Passage would take an average of about 60 days, and about 12% of those who embarked would die in the passage. As I said at the beginning, part of the reason we want to highlight this is because we want to educate ourselves on, as we see these massive changes going on in Latin America, where some of the countries have recognized their Afro-descendant populations, have finally started counting them. We know maybe Colombians are maybe 10% are Afro-descendants. Mexico finally asked the question in this last census. The numbers are probably wrong. They're probably underestimated. There's genetics kind of work trying to figure this out, but we really have this reckoning that is, very necessary. So throughout the course of these few months, we will try to shed some spotlight on questions like religion in the U.S. South, which might not sound like something we do in Latin American studies, but we want to shed a light on that. We'll talk about Nueva York and the Latinx populations and the Afro-descendants in New York. We will also have Jonathan Rosa from the Comparative Center for Race and Ethnicity within our seminar series. So I wanted to kind of clarify a little bit why we are setting up things in this way. Okay, finally, time to introduce Dr. Clayborne Carson. He is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor of History, emeritus at Stanford University. He has devoted his professional life to the study of Martin Luther King and the human rights movements that inspired by King, by also Mohandas Gandhi's and other visionaries. His award-winning first book, which is called Struggle, SNCC and the Black Awakening of the 1960s, was published in 1981 and still remains to this day the definite study on the courageous activists and organizers who challenged the strongholds of segregation. In 1985, Mrs. Coretta Scott King chose Dr. Carson to be the one who would edit and publish a definitive multi-volume edition of her late husband's speeches, sermons, correspondence, publications, and unpublished writings. In addition to publishing numerous books and scholarly articles, Carson has also been researched the broader audiences as a senior advisor of Eyes on the Prize series, and his contributions to more than 2 dozen subsequent documentaries. Dr. Carson, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. I have to admit, somewhat embarrassingly, that this is my first time here, and although I mentioned that as an undergraduate, Latin American studies was my field, but once I went to graduate school, it gradually moved over to the study of the civil rights struggle, because I felt that since I was involved in that struggle, that it needed more serious work. And although I remember when I was in graduate school, I was initially going to go to Brazil to study comparative urbanization. And then I had the misfortune of not getting the Fulbright I wanted. And so I quickly shifted gears. And someone said, well, seeing the things you've written about the civil rights struggle, why don't you do that? I said, well, that's not history. And I remember my advisor correcting me and said, anything you get 4 people in the faculty to sign is a sufficient reason to do the research, and it will be acceptable. So I was really writing about something that was contemporary. I was contemporary of many of the people. And I should mention that in itself brought me to a broader understanding, because among the people who I got to meet, my first person in the movement was a person by the name of Stokely Carmichael. And he was a student like myself. He was going to Howard. And I talked with him about whether I should go to the March on Washington, and he said, well, why would you want to go to that picnic? Why don't you come and join us in the South? And I recall somewhat embarrassing that even going to the March on Washington was probably the most radical thing I'd done in my life to that point. But I stayed in touch with him for the rest of his life, and he became part of what I would call the internationalization of the African American struggle. He spent much of the rest of his life in West Africa after some years in the movement. And I think he was a pioneer in terms of understanding this connection between the African American struggle and struggles elsewhere. So that would be the subject, but I gave the title, Where Do We Go From Here? And that, of course, comes from King's last book. And he follows that question with chaos or community. And to say that this is a rather important question to be answered. Where do we go from here? And in recent years, I've kind of come back to that question just because of its contemporary relevance. Have we even come closer to answering that question? If anything, I think it's become much more complicated, even though it's a very simple question. And he says, warns us that if you get the wrong answer, get either chaos or community. And it's on a global level, not just on a local level. And that became the source of the idea for the World House Project, which is over at FSI. Started that about 2 years ago. And the idea is to take that metaphor seriously. And if King is saying we are all doomed or privileged to live in the World House, that's probably the only place we will live during our lifetime, unless Elon Musk gets a lot of rockets ready for us. And that'll only be the elite who can go someplace else. But I think that what it suggests is that to live peacefully in a just world community, we have to learn from the past. So when you take that question, where do we go from here? The way I would take it is start at the end, here, and ask the question, how did we get here? And I think that the answer to that is more complicated than we might think. As historians, some of you are studying history on your own, the questions become increasingly critical. One need only turn on the news to realize that the world is not in good shape at the moment. That here is a perilous place to be for many people throughout the world. So it is very important to figure out, how did we get here? How did we get to this point? And I think for a long time, the answers that not only historians, but scholars in general gave is a story about how we got to this moment in time when the world is interconnected in various ways. We got there because of a process I could call the civilization process, that gradually Europe expanded its reach, starting a millennium ago when they had the technology to move about the world. And that story, as told by most literate people, who also happen to be mostly white during that time, was one of, we brought civilization to the world. And it was deemed that by the Pope of the time, who said, as long as you're bringing Christianity, this effort to build global empires was deemed an immoral process. You were bringing Christianity. And of course, many of you have heard the saying in Africa that the Europeans came with the Bible, and when they left, we had the Bible, they had the land. And it's kind of a cynical way of looking at that, but there's a lot of truth in that notion that this became the justification for colonizing the world. And in that process, we know from the historians that existed maybe before the 20th century, the vast majority of them would say, whatever happened during that period was, in the main, a good process. It certainly had good results for Europe, making it very rich, making all of the people who stayed in Europe more wealthy than they would otherwise be. the people who came to the colonies had opportunities that they might not have had in their home country and did very well. And so the story of that expansion of what I could call the European empire is told as this process of civilizing the rest of the world. And until really maybe 2 centuries ago at the most, we didn't have too many contrary stories, in part because the language in which that story was told was a European language. People who were most literate of that time, that's the story that they created and became familiar to us, and really was the dominant narrative. And what we have in terms of that story of how do we get to here is in the last 200 years ago, as more people in the colonies, the subjects, the colonies that you were referring to, who were here, people in Africa, many of the countries in Latin America, all of them saw that as a process that was well understood and had more good results than bad results. And it was only when you have people who are subjects of European power and colonialism that you begin to get a counter narrative. And that's really the field of African American history. You begin to see people who are either slaves or ex-slaves somehow becoming literate, so that they can create this counter narrative. People like Frederick Douglass, for example, in the 19th century, W.E.B. Du Bois in the 20th century, all of them presenting counter narratives. And this was facilitated by a number of trends, and that is increasing literacy. And indeed, when you look at the birth of the notion of human rights as a universal right, it really is the expansion of literacy that allows people who are not as part of the dominant groups to tell their story. In the African American history was really built on slave narratives. That slaves learning how to tell their own story, sometimes in the form of books like Frederick Douglass, but sometimes also in terms of music, song, other ways of telling a counter story. And then also in the 19th century, you begin to see some of these intellectuals, and I call them that because they were innovative, and some of them very smart, beginning to become familiar with other parts of the world. Frederick Douglass spent time in Europe, and Great Britain. Du Bois studied at the University of Berlin. Was able to begin to see the world in this new way. And that really formed the basis of the field I'm in today. And that is, I used to call it African American history, but increasingly I'm calling it international history. Because particularly in the last few decades, just today I was listening to Robert Franklin, who a good friend who used to be president of Morehouse College, where I taught. And he just finished a trip where he went to the Caribbean, went to Great Britain, and then went to Indonesia, because he was tracing the development of this notion of, I guess I could call it pan-Caribbean thought, pan-American thought, pan-African thought, all of these notions that there is a different kind of consciousness, a different way of looking at this process of how did we get to here. And that's really been the focus of not only my research in terms of an answer to King's question, but I think it's increasingly becoming a field that you might encounter, internationalism, of trying to look at the world through the eyes of those who were the subjects of colonialism, who were the descendants of slaves, those who experienced that whole globalization in a different way, in a distinctive way, and in part resisting it. Not only understanding that they had been victimized, but developing ways of struggling against that domination. And in the process, informing other people in other places, so that the African American freedom struggle takes many of its cues from the Gandhian struggle in India for independence, takes cues from the Pan-African conferences that are sponsored by Du Bois starting in 1900. So over the last more than a century, we've had these meetings where particularly intellectuals, writers, historians and other kinds of scholars have come together to share these ideas about how did we get to this point. Now, to really get into my perspective of this, you'd have to see that when I became involved in studying the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the organization that I became very familiar with during the 1960s, what I liked about it was that it was organized around the idea of grassroots struggle, that notion of bottom-up history. And that has had an enormous impact in the way in which I view history, of wanting to look at the perspectives of those who were victimized by the domination of others, and develop ways of looking not only at the reality of that, but developing ways of struggling successfully against that. How do you build a successful movement of not only getting rid of racial domination, but getting rid of colonialism, getting rid of imperialism? And that has been a fascinating. When he talked just this morning on our Zoom call, he had just gotten back from this trip and was kind of unloading all this information gained from going to these sites and seeing how important that was, not only for the descendants of victims of colonialism, victims of other kinds of global oppression, but how those ideas have merged with ideas from working class movements around the world, of seeing that movements by the proletarian classes in various countries have also shared ideas with the movements for get rid of colonialism, get rid of imperialism, get rid of all forms of racial domination. And I'm putting that out because very often the story of what can be called human rights, the notion that every human being deserves certain rights, is seen as something that developed because European intellectuals kind of invented that idea. Sometime in the 18th century, we begin to see people talking in terms of human rights. And indeed, you see the influence of this talk about human rights in the French Revolution, the American Revolution. It's used as a justification for these revolutions that had fairly minor impact on the broader issue of world domination and colonialism and imperialism. Indeed, one of the things we would have to say is that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were followed by the greatest expansion of imperialism that the world has ever seen. And it's interesting how you could have both these narratives of all men are created equal with a narrative, but some are subordinate and others are dominant. And that contradiction, of course, has been pointed out by a whole line of African American leaders, including Martin Luther King. And indeed, that contradiction between the ideal and the reality is one of the fulcrum around which internationalism has developed. So how does this apply to where we are now? I think that part of what I see happening in the world is this conflict between these two different narratives. And it's one of the reasons why, in my view, teaching in the schools, the 1619 project, critical responses to historians who write counter narratives, is that this is seen as a real threat. And I think it is. I think it is something that is very consciously trying to change the notion of what American history is, how it should be told, how young people such as yourself should learn about it. Now, let's be clear. I think I'm thinking of this notion that some parents have. Oh, you're poisoning the mind of our young kids who are made to feel guilty by slavery. I'm talking about white kids, And but the problem with that is that when you look through both of these narratives, there's a negative role for white people and a positive role. You can study slavery and emphasize William Lloyd Garrison as an anti-slavery activist, or John Brown, or people who put their lives on the line to end slavery. So the way I would respond to this complaining parent is, just tell your kid to root for the right side in the past. Let them hear the full story of how cruel slavery is, but they don't have to identify with a slaveholder. They can identify with the anti-slavery activists. So that's one of the ways in which this notion of how did we get here becomes very contentious. And we're far from any kind of resolution of that. But I think that when we look at the question in its whole, there's another word in it that needs to be defined, and that is we. Who are the we who are going to get us to a better future? And much of the discussion about the counter narrative is who are the liberators? Who are the ones who are going to make this a better world, avoid chaos, have community? How are we going to achieve that? And I think that is also a very contentious answer, in the sense that not everyone believes that we can ever be united by those who are dominant, those who are subordinate. And there are people on both sides who would say that that's impossible. I mean, if you talk to a Black nationalist, we as Black people, we talk to many people who are experiencing oppressive conditions. One of the easiest response is to say, look, you get all the oppressed together, build a movement, whatever ideas succeed, is, that's becomes basically the true account. And in African American literature, you see examples of that. You see that with Marcus Garvey. You see that with the Nation of Islam. That they have their own narrative, and it's not a narrative that promises that the future here is going to be peaceful. It might well be a very chaotic, with every group developing its own consciousness, developing its own mode of struggle, and ending up that the world is divided. And one side will win, one side will lose, and that could be an outcome. And that's what I think that King is talking about when he's referring to chaos. Community would be much harder. Community is much harder to build, and I think the thing that King would add, though, what choice do we have? Either we develop a consciousness that is inclusive, or we will end up in a very violent, chaotic world. And you can see this in the rise of various kinds of nationalism that are exclusive. That, of course, we cannot build a united world. When does that ever happen? We've had the rise of nationalism in every part of the world. And the idea that our history is much more divided, necessarily so, because we've had different historical experiences. Therefore, we have to recognize those differences and begin to build movements that capitalize on that rather than see that as a problem. And I think that, again, when I look at the daily newspaper and look at magazines that I read, I see that that is something that is at the center of the discussion. Can you build a notion of human rights that is truly global? Is that possible? Is it possible to build a community of people who have had somewhat different experiences, but united in that notion that there's something better out there? And I think for many people, it will be, I'll only believe that if that's necessary to avoid the chaos. And but I think that if you begin to look at the literature that has been done over the past few decades, you can see that more and more people are moving in that direction. And that is true in African American history, of moving away from some of the separatism that developed out of the African American struggle. So that by the 1990s, you had someone like Minister Farrakhan drawing 1 million people to Washington, who were basically saying, look, we have our own destiny. We have to worry about that destiny. Don't try to fool us by believing that there can be a common destiny with the people who have oppressed us for centuries. Now, I think that discussion is by no means over. We still have a great deal of I guess, contentious argument about whether these differences can be reconciled. But I see that that's one of the most difficult parts of the question to ask, because you have to have some sense of who are your allies. Who are the people who can be brought into that struggle and will truly be your allies through that struggle? So I see part of what the World House Project is trying to do is provide some educational resources that feed into that ideas. And that's why I include things like looking closely at working class movements, looking closely at do they necessarily, if it's a white or European working class movement, is it necessarily racist? Are there other possibilities? Have there been other options that have been explored and maybe not emphasized enough? For example, when you look at in the United States at the rise of labor unions in the 19th century, the populist movement, we tend to look back and emphasize, well, didn't it all end up in the racist exclusion of immigrants, after World War I, the rise of the Klan, the other signs that this is just not a possible outcome. And I know within my history of the civil rights movement in the book that I was referred to earlier, both of these tendencies developed. The civil rights movement could not have made the gains it made without the participation of white activists during the early 1960s. But on the other hand, those racial tensions within SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, eventually led to the expulsion of blacks from the group. Now, by that time, it was smaller in terms of impact anyway. But I think these kinds of narratives make it clear that this question that King left us with is a difficult question. It's not readily answered. Also, the historical work that has been done of using Haiti as a counter narrative and has an impact. Haiti was the first truly important revolution based around human rights ideas. Because as we can see, for Haiti, this was a movement led and guided by Black Haitians. But we can also see in the reaction of the United States and France to Haiti, what does that confirm? That maybe these two ideas are not compatible, that Haiti was not allowed to be a model for the rest of Latin America, that it might have been, if not for the intervention of the French and the Americans to reinstitute slavery and to punish Haiti, and literally punish it by, of course, forcing it to pay reparations, not to the slave, but to the slaveholders. And the only way in which Haiti was recognized by the rest of the world officially was when it agreed to pay these reparations. And those reparations were not fully paid until the 1940s. And we wonder why Haiti, and this was also enforced by taking over the National Bank of Haiti, so that before anything was distributed by the government in Haiti, the due amount for the reparations had to be paid first. So, where does that leave us? And it gets back to the beginning of the question: where do we go from here? What direction? And I think it's clear when the direction that would be the one I'd like to see happen is toward universal human rights, toward a community that is based around equality, justice for all. Am I likely to see that in my lifetime? I don't think so. In your lifetime, you can make your own judgment about that. My own sense of it is that human rights at the moment is a rather, what would be the best word for it, imaginary notion, especially when we try to apply it to the world. And I think that it was only in the last 5 years that I began teaching a course on civil rights and human rights, and I found that most students came into the class not knowing the difference. And I kind of proved this by saying, well, what human right do you have? And who is protecting it? Because if you feel you have a human right and no one is protecting it, is that really a human right that you have? And I looked at it and said, well, what I proposed is this hypothetical story. Somebody comes to me and says, look, I'm from a third world nation, very poor, very dominated by multinational corporations. And I decided that my best option is to become an American. And that calculation is probably happening a million times right now. But they come to you or any of you, and say, you have a US passport. I'm from a very poor country, but I'm very rich. And I'd like to change identities with you. What would you want in return for giving up your identity, taking this other person, say they're from Yemen? I say, well, no, I'm a millionaire in Yemen. I don't like it there. It's a pretty bad place. But if I gave you $10 million, $100 million, hey, you could. What would it take to convince you that this is a good deal for you? And when they started thinking about it, they realized I'd pay a lot, or I'd have to be paid a lot before I give up. And so what does that tell you about the distinction between civil rights and human rights? Because with a lot of money, you could have a lot of human rights, abilities. You could travel, you could have a nice mansion someplace. And why wouldn't you exchange it? And I think it really comes down to who is going to protect it. That is the ultimate test of whether you really have a right. And right now, there is no other guarantee of your right that is more important than what country are you from? How much power does it have? And I realized as I was giving this that I'm talking to people who travel widely throughout the world. And I realized I have a human right to travel wherever I want. If I could go through, I've been to China, I've been to the West Bank, I've been to just lots of different places that are, I've been to the Sahara, and in all those places, my passport got me a special treatment. And without it, I'd be in deep trouble. And so that is one of the ways I would look at that distinction between a civil right and a human right. The human right is this purely hypothetical notion that if we had a different kind of world, you would have a different kind of right. But it all depends on who is going to protect it. So, I'll leave you with that in the sense of my original question. I think it is an extremely urgent question today. It's one that is not often posed as maybe as dramatically as I put it. What passport do you want? But I think until we begin to understand that distinction between the dominant powers in the world and the rest of us, we won't really get closer to an answer to that question, not only where we are today, but who can we ally with to make a better world, and what direction should we be headed. So with that, I'll just say, I pose this as a question. I wish I could have come here and just given you a good answer to that question. I think that Martin Luther King would be very proud of me if it was able. I think he came pretty close to try to answer that. But I see us going through a period where we have to learn more about how did we get to this point in history. Thank you.
Before I open to questions from the audience here, I do want to mention there's this outpouring of, just greetings and goodwill from people that love you. We get messages from North Carolina. Somebody reminds that it's so good to be here linked with Dr. Carson's lecture. Reminds me of a lecture in Martin Luther King's time at the Penn Center in the 1960s. Somebody tells us from Bahia. Somebody is joining us from Thailand. We just have this outpouring of good wishes and excitement about having you here with us. But let's open up to some questions, and I'll make sure I'll get also to a couple of questions that are in the YouTube channel. So please, questions.
Thank you so much for that incredible talk. One thing you mentioned is that you said that human rights at the moment is a rather imaginary notion. I think of a lot of the movements towards justice these days are kind of based on like a lot of imagination. And I wonder, when you think of kind of making that concrete, what does that process look like?
Well, I think that going back to King's question, the way he phrased it, and the fact that the question is in the same chapter as his description of the World House ideal, I think you can see that he recognized that it's a very difficult question to answer. That it will require people to alter their understanding of their own identity, because that history that I referred to is that has given you the identity, whatever identity that you have. It didn't start with your parents, it didn't start with you, it started way back in your cultural experiences. And so unpacking that is very difficult. It's difficult for the oppressed people in the world, because you are essentially reliving and looking deeply at your own oppression and saying, is there a way out of this? But if you are the dominant group, do you feel threatened by the counter story? Do you? And one of the things that could be in part of the lecture is looking at the impact of the Cold War, because I think that after World War II, there was a certain momentum about we've just gone through a war against fascism and against imperialism. And we might have said, look, there's got to be a better way of organizing the world. Why didn't that work? And I think clearly it was because the winners in the war didn't want to give up their sovereignty, didn't want to give up their power. They wanted to create their own form of imperialism. And they not only said this for themselves, which is one thing. You had the Cold War internally to the United States, and people went to jail if they were seen as pro-communist. But I think more importantly, it was imposed on the rest of the world. Because after World War II, you had this decolonization movement. And people recognized it, at least some people did, that the colonies had to be freed. But what was going to happen after freedom became the issue of the Cold War. Were they going to come out of that decolonization experience leaning toward the Soviet Union or leaning toward the United States? And we fought some of the bloodiest wars of the last century over that question of which direction. I hate even the idea of calling it a Cold War. It was not a Cold War in large parts of the Third World. It was the regular kind of war. There was nothing cold about it. It was a hot war. Tens of thousands of people, even billions of people died in that war. And even today, there's little sense of freedom to make your own decision in those former colonies about how to proceed. I guess it's somewhat of that notion that Africa gave up the land for the Bible. Well, what did decolonization bring? And one of the things that is very clear is that you supposedly freed the nation, but above the ground and below the ground, nothing changed. That is, all the resources of Africa are still in the hands of the colonizers. And indeed, part of the reason why some places gain their freedom easier than other places is, number one, they didn't have very much below the ground, so they weren't seen as that important. Secondly, they didn't have as many people who were colonizers. That is, places like South Africa, where a lot of, many of the nations of the world were peopled by Europeans. And that was the way in which many Europeans gained the new lease on opportunity. Go to a colony. You'll do much better there than you will in the home country. And indeed, look at their biggest colony, the United States. You'll do much better there than you will back in England. And that's why you come there, so that you can do well. So in all of these instances, the choice for the colony was either to become an empire by itself, and to some degree we see that with South Africa, for example, of becoming, essentially colonizing the rest of Southern Africa. We see that with the United States, gaining its independence and then colonizing the rest of the continent. And as you mentioned, this is one of the results. So how could that have been done differently? And even now, how are we going to proceed differently? So I think it's still a tough question, and I pose this because you're young enough to really think that maybe you can answer it. And however urgent it is, I think there's another aspect of this, is that whenever there's a liberation movement of any kind, there's always a backlash to it. Always. That is, people don't give up advantage easily. They find new ways of exerting. And like, for example, I have, when I look back at and say, why did we have this reaction against the civil rights movement. And we certainly did. You have a whole generation, tens of millions of white Americans who had never voted for anything other than the Democratic Party. Within a few years, from that point on, they never again will vote for the Democratic Party. How does that happen? It's a backlash. It is, if we can't be in charge, we'll find another way of being in charge. And so the civil rights struggle, which made some gains, obviously, was hampered by what happened later as that movement of the white South from one party to another party. And to this day, that has become another battleground in the fight for rights. Whether can that be resolved easily? I don't know. We'll find out in about a month, won't we? Yes.
Yes.
Professor Carson, it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for your lecture. I have the impression that humankind has always been in these tumultuous scenarios of invasions, segregations, racism, and somehow after Second World War, I guess, where in modern times that war generated a lot of union, within the universe at that time, and it seems like the death of leaders like Martin Luther King brings in wider perspective towards what we as humanity need to be thinking of and acting upon in order to have a much more just society.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, since Second World War, United Nations was created.
United Nations.
And within United Nations, there is a Convention on Human Rights.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a vehicle, and I am pretty sure that all these different chaos throughout the world have been inserted into those charters of such convention, which somehow intends and reflects the desire of achieving a peaceful planet. What else is needed to make that a stronger and I know there's power there, you mentioned. So that's one question. What do you think it would be needed to strengthen that, if possible? And the other one, very simple. What do you think about the song from John Lennon, Imagine? Thank you.
I like the song.
Yes.
I think that let's be clear about what the United Nations Convention on Human Rights was a sop that was thrown to people who believe in human rights. That was it. There was never any likelihood that the United States or the Soviet Union would accept anything other than that. The strongest arguments against even having the United States in the United Nations was from Southerners who said, well, we don't want to have anything that's going to apply to us. That's why, one of the reasons why we didn't join the League of Nations. And so to have a set of principles with no enforcement mechanism that is, applies out, and I guess you could say, oh yes, there was a provision against genocide. Well, how effective has that been? I think that it was important to state the idea. You have to have a vision. What would it look like to live in a human rights world. And all I have to just give you one example. What would it look like to all of you to live in a world without borders? If tomorrow, every checkpoint, every passport, anybody in the world could move any place they want. And I'm describing the world that I live in because I do have a passport, and I've taught in, as I said, I've never been stopped at the border. But look what happened just a couple of weeks ago with people who are kidnapped because they crossed the border. So I think all you have to do is kind of imagine for yourself. Are you threatened by that idea personally? If every country just said, yeah, look, if you want to move here, fine. Because quite frankly, that is the world in which the rich live. They don't have to worry about whether they're going to be accepted as American citizens. If you are rich enough and have certain kinds of skills, you can be my next door neighbor wherever you are in the world today. And in fact, I could name a few who probably followed that path. And you see Palo Alto is kind of a prime example of that. For a certain class of people, there are no borders. So how do we feel about making that available to everybody? I feel pretty good about it. I think the world would be a better place. But I'm not saying that wouldn't cause a lot of disruption. But what we have creates a lot of disruption, except that it's just not on our doorstep. So I don't know if that, kind of gets that.
So I have to stop right now the broadcast part of our conversation. We can have a couple more questions here.
Now I can answer honestly.
Yes.